Wen for gracing our library presence. It's great to have you here. My name is Kelly McHenry. I'm a librarian here, and we do a social issues series every Thursday at noon. Since your class has been at noon this quarter, I know it's been difficult to come here, so I'm really glad you could be here today to see this excellent presentation. Why the library does this? Well, the library's job is to promote freedom of information, and we do that by having all kinds of resources in the library from different points of view. And just like all the things in our library are representing different points of view, we want to have discussions that represent different points of view. So in these discussions, I hope you'll feel free to give your point of view and give respect to everybody else who has a different point of view. And I hope that you're able to come to some of our sessions next quarter. We plan to keep doing this as long as there's interest, and they have been pretty heavily attended, so I think there's a good future ahead of it. Thank you again. I would now like to introduce our speaker, John Martinez. He teaches ESL here at the college, and he's very involved in social justice issues, especially in the area of immigration. And please join me in welcoming Mr. Martinez.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is John Martinez, and I am, like Kelly said, I'm a faculty here teaching GED and ESL at the college. I am also a member of our teachers union. It's called American Federation of Teachers, AFT, and the number is 1789. So that's our union at the three colleges, at South, North, and Central. So we represent all the faculty. Our union has a Human and Civil Rights Committee, and I am the chair of the Human and Civil Rights Committee. I was elected by the union members to do that job. What we have done as a Human and Civil Rights Committee and as a union is to take up the issue of immigration, especially where it affects our students and students' families. We are supporters of the DREAM Act. We have formally participated in activities promoting the DREAM Act, allowing undocumented students to continue studying in the United States. We have also supported students who have faced deportation, and we have organized activities to defend them. We have participated in the immigrant rights marches, demanding protecting driver's license access, and promoting the movement against Secure Communities. Secure Communities is a federal program that tries to use local police like immigration agents. And we fight against that as well. So the theme of our union is we are trying not only to promote education, but the rights and liberties of our students, all our students, and their families. So I'm very happy to be part of that. And I'm very happy to be able to present this information today to give you a little background about these issues. So the presentation today is also for our faculty as well as for our students. This is information that does not get discussed very much, and many times when people think about immigration, they just think about the immediate situation and they don't think about the history of what's happened in this country. So a lot of times, a lot of people get emotional about immigration, but we try to present the facts and history to make people think more rationally about it. This is a local newspaper called Asian Weekly, and this is the issue from June of this year, during the summer. And the headline is, "A Past Wrong Corrected, Expressing Regret for Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And this is, you'll see it, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act. The United States Congress finally passed the resolution saying that the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was wrong. The Congress has done this in other cases too, regarding the internment of Japanese and other kinds of decisions that the U.S. Congress has made. So this summer, the United States Congress finally, after all these years, finally recognized that what happened here was wrong. And they passed a resolution. And very interesting, the member of Congress who promoted this act was Representative Judy Chu, Chinese American woman in Congress. It's a big, big change. It's a big, big distance from this until this. But there's a lot of history that went on before to help us understand why this happened. Okay? Why this happened. One other change, besides the Congress making this decision, is in the New York Times. This is the New York Times from June, again, from June of this year. And you can look it up on the web. Here's the headline. It says, in a shift, biggest wave of migrants is now Asian. Migrants where? Where do you think? Migrants to what country?
Into the U.S.
Into the United States. Okay? Into the United States. More Asian people are coming into the United States than any other group. At least for now. It's possible that this may change again, but this is possibly the more permanent trend, is that more Asian people will come into the United States. Right now, many people from Latin America do not. Less come in because, of course, of the situation on the border with more police and army and helicopters. It's very difficult to come in over land, but still more and more people come from Asia, mostly family. Okay, mostly family. So it's a big change. Again, when we think about this and we look at this, it's a big, big change. And finally, I want to share one other item, again, from one of the recent newspapers. This is from October's, last month. This is just from last month. The headline says, Protestants lose majority status in the U.S. What are Protestants?
Religion.
Religious, right. It's one part of the Christian church, right? Very large part of the Christian church, and there are other parts are Catholics and other groups that are consider themselves Christian, but in the United States, for centuries, right? For centuries, the people who called themselves Protestants were the majority and the dominant majority. The dominant majority. And there were periods of violence in American history that arose from this kind of situation. But that's changed now. So I presented some indicators of change from what's happened before in the United States. But still, this legacy, the memory of this and all these other acts are still very strong in our society. And that's why our union joins with other organizations like One America or other organizations to continue to fight for people's rights, civil rights, because we haven't finished yet. A lot of this wants to come back, okay? We need to understand that. A lot of this wants to come back, and we need to be prepared to challenge it. Okay, just a little bit, here we go. Let's begin with the U.S. Constitution. Because the U.S. Constitution has something called Article 1, Section 9, and you'll see that this is on your bibliography, okay? It's on your list, but any resource will give you the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution established our modern government. After 10 years of the Articles of Confederation, the people at that time decided they needed a stronger central government and more control, so they wrote up the United States Constitution. It was ratified in 1789. One of the big problems with the U.S. Constitution was that at that time, the people involved did not want to admit that there was slavery in this country. So they used other words to refer to it, but never said directly, we have slaves. But you can find in the Constitution, there were a lot of references to it. One I want to mention is Article 1, Section 9. It's very short, very brief. It says, the migration, okay? The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, 20 years later. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 per each person. Okay, so it looks like it's talking about migration, perhaps a fee you pay to get in, but actually it wasn't. This was a reference to slave trade. This was a reference that each state, and not all of them, but each state could still bring in slaves from Africa. And they would pay the central government $10 for each slave that would come in. So this is the direct reference. And in fact, 20 years later, President Jefferson wrote in and signed a law that said that stopped foreign importations of slaves into the United States. But between that time, 1789 to 1808, all the states had their own control. They can bring in as many as they want. They just had to pay the $10 fee, and it's exactly what happened. In fact, it was so strong that after 1808, people were smuggling slaves in without paying the fee, illegally. Over 80,000, some people think. Over 80,000 Africans were brought in after 1808 into the United States in violation of the law. Some people say these were the first illegal aliens. Okay? But it was a huge number. It was very profitable. Very profitable. But the people didn't want to talk about this kind of situation. But sometimes the words did get out. So in this little book, there are some notes about how the people were discussing this document. And one gentleman, Mr. Mason, very famous for discussing the US Constitution, he said, the Western people, the people in the Western United States, Appalachia, Ohio, are already calling out for slaves for their new lands. This is 1789. And will fill that country with slaves if they can be got to the south, through South Carolina and Georgia. Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. So Mr. Mason had a problem with slaves. But slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor people despise labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the immigration of whites who really enrich and strengthen a country. Already at this time, the rulers of this country writing up the Constitution knew exactly that they had to control slavery, but they controlled it in order to promote the immigration of whites. So it's introduction of exclusion and inclusion. It begins here. And then actually it begins soon afterwards when the Constitution says that the Congress must regulate naturalization. Who becomes a citizen? Who becomes a citizen? Naturalization. The law written here in 1790 was very clear. The only persons who can become a U.S. citizen can only be a free white person. That's the law. It was just those words. Free and white. Okay? And of course, they knew who they were. But anyone trying to become a citizen knew that you could not if you're not white. If you were not white, you could still come in. You could still immigrate, but you could not become a citizen. And this became important later when this actually became a limiting factor for just immigration. It started out as a naturalization decision, but later on it affected immigration, just who could come in. So it had a lot of consequences. So for the first 50 years...
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can I ask a question? So how did they define what was white?
There was no official definition. In fact, this is a very interesting question because for the next 50 years, all the states could just let anyone in. But the question of naturalization was who becomes white was actually very varied, because states and states courts could conduct a naturalization service, so there was no real control. So if you were lucky, and if you were fair enough, you might find a small court in some county that would make you a citizen. But if you were unlucky, and they looked at you and they said, you're not white, and you didn't get it. And they just said, this group. Yes?
So I learned in history that a lot of Europeans came and they have set a contract to work at a maid for rich people in America. So that technically they're not free, but they're white.
Right.
So can they become citizen?
Good question. Did everybody hear that? A lot of Europeans came as indentured. They signed a contract in their home country to come to America, work for 5 or 7 years, pay the ticket, and become and then fulfill their contract. That's why they say free and white, because after you finish the contract, then you're free. Okay? So you were both. Your people from European were then free and white and could become citizens. So the other question, yeah, it's a good question, is at this time there was a lot of discussion about what is white. There was a lot of scientific racialism going on. People were trying to measure physical characteristics of what is white. Linnaeus and some other scientists were beginning to develop systems for categorization of species. And people are wondering, well, gee, do white peoples and black people have the same origin? Do we have separate Adam and Eve here and there? And these were the kind of questions people were trying to devise, because black and white was very political. And it meant you go up or you go down. It was that simple. Literature was also very influenced by this idea. So a lot of English romanticists were writing novels about the beautiful days of knights, Ivanhoe, Sir Walter Scott. They were writing stories about how beautiful it was when the English and German people were pure, coming out from their forests, but coming out with their traditions of democracy. So a fantasy developed. So it was scientific, it was fantasy, it was just anything they could devise in order to protect that kind of status, white only. Slowly, the United States government began to take control of immigration into the country. 1819, they said, okay, every ship that comes in must give us a list of who's on board. Small, okay? There was no immigration service. It was all customs. Customs, when a ship comes to port, the captain has to say, I have a lot of cotton, you pay a tax, then you go on. But besides the ships coming to port, increased immigration. So these were not indentured servants now. Through the 30s and the 40s, a lot of changes in Europe, just like in the United States. Industrialization. Industrialization in the United States. They needed a lot of workers. Industrialization in Europe. A lot of farmers went to the cities, but at the same time, there were a lot of extra farmers who could not find work. So there was a big migration of people looking for work coming to the United States, from Germany, from Ireland. The potato famine of 1844 in Ireland and Germany. Millions of people died, but many came to the United States. Well, these people were mostly Catholic. And when they arrived, the factory owners were happy to see them. The new factories, the new manufacturers, shoes and cloth and glass and metal, and the first railroads needed all these workers to come to the United States. So they were happy to see them, but a lot of the native-born Americans had problems with that. So there was violence against these people. We didn't speak English. Irish had very strong accents. They spoke Gaelic. Germans, of course, spoke German. And there was a lot of violence against those activities. In fact, some states were even passing anti-Catholic laws. You cannot get a job, you cannot It's a lot like Arizona now. It's a lot like Arizona. Was it 1079? The bill in Arizona? Yeah. You cannot do business if you're a Catholic. Finally, those laws were overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Same time, though, the feelings of white privilege were very strong. And it got even stronger because American people were moving fast across the continent. At the time of President Polk, the United States took over this area, Washington and Oregon. In fact, they originally wanted to go another 100 miles north into Canada, to go even bigger. But because of some negotiations with the British, that didn't happen like that. So we have our border up here at Blaine, south of Vancouver. But the idea was to grab a lot of territory, and the United States did. But the big push in territory was the United States took control of almost a third of Mexico. This is very interesting. 1846, Polk's War. In fact, one of the books in this bibliography on Merck, number 8, Manifest Destiny and Mission in American History, they deal with the Mexican-American War quite a bit in terms of what did the American people see with the war against Mexico. In 1830s, Texas had become a free, independent country. So Texas was like a republic. But many white Americans were moving into Texas. They wanted to take over more of the area that belonged to Mexico in the south. The United States said that they were attacked on a river along Mexico, and the war began in 1846. This war and the United States armies marched all the way to Mexico City. The Mexican army could not put up regular resistance. The Mexican army just fought small guerrilla battles. But the United States army reached all the way to Mexico City and controlled it. So what happened in the United States? This war really split opinion in the United States. Some people didn't like it because they said, oh no, it makes the United States like a European empire. And that's bad for democracy. But other people said, no. Mexico is so rich. Silver, copper, ports, isthmus, cotton. So they wanted Mexico. Other people said, with Mexico we can spread more slaves to farm cotton. Other people said, no, we don't want the Mexicans. The Mexicans are not white. They're mostly Indian. They speak Spanish. They're Catholic. So we don't want. So there was a big debate, in the United States about what to do with Mexico. Finally, the decision was made just to keep the northern part. And the United States paid Mexico $30 million. But what happened was, it was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the United States took over Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, California. The United States, with Oregon and Washington, during the time of this president, the continental size of the United States doubled. But the interesting thing about this war was that the United States government was looking at the people of Mexico and trying to decide, what do we do with them? Do we send our white soldiers down to have mixed babies? Okay, this is the way they talk. Do we send our white soldiers to Mexico to make mixed babies and start a new society? How do we teach Mexican people to behave and to learn democracy? So this is the kind of language that was used at this time. But what happened was that a big part of Mexico was taken. And for people of Mexico, those lands still really belong together. That's why it's such an injustice to put a wall across the US-Mexico border. Because the Mexican army and the Mexican people tried to defend their sovereignty. The American army was quite savage, because they knew that they were taking land for themselves. And then they signed a treaty. Mexico lost almost a third of their territory, and a lot of the Texans started stealing land from the Mexican people left behind. They had land grants from the time of the King of Spain, from the government of Mexico. They started losing their land grants through the courts, and to this day, the Mexican people of New Mexico and Texas are very poor. And the big ranches, the big farms, were mostly American owned. So this is part of the history today. When people complain about Mexicans coming here to work, Mexican people really were in all parts of the United States, including California, but we were cheated, okay? We were cheated from that history, and the situation today is very different. And then, of course, in 1850, gold was discovered in California, and everybody wanted to come there. There was no railroad yet to California, so people from east had to go by covered wagon to California to try to participate in the gold rush, including Chinese. So here's a different chapter of our story. The Chinese at this time were going through very difficult times. On the one hand, the emperor was having trouble controlling his country, and there were Taiping rebellions and other rebellions in China destabilizing the country. But also the European countries were beginning to move into China, take control of their wealth, and try to take from China. But the big movement in China was the selling of opium. The British, through their East India Company, were bringing opium from India and Afghanistan into China. And against the wishes of the Chinese government, they kept selling tons of it. So the Chinese were having tremendous problems, and a lot of them wanted to immigrate and leave and try something else. So many came to California, probably in the first few years, probably 10,000. Chinese come to California, participate in the gold rush. Chinese are smart. They came in and organized themselves to dig for gold. But they realized, they were very good, but they realized there's more money to be made with other services. Restaurant, hotel, tailor, right? Make clothes. So the Chinese were actually quite entrepreneur. They were very entrepreneur and making, and more were coming in. But of course, more white people were coming in too. And that created a conflict. And what's interesting here is this conflict that develops in California is going to affect immigration policy later on. So in 1850, there's more immigration into the United States from Europe, from Latin America. So most of those want to go find gold, but others continue to come into the United States, to the farmlands, to the middle. In fact, states like Wisconsin would send people to Europe to recruit. They would open office. They would have big signs, come to America, farms, and we will help you. So there was also recruiting going on. So the movement of people was increasing from the east and Chinese in the west. But the issue of slavery never goes away. So this is the difficult part. Traditional American history is taught like different chapters. Like slavery is chapter 12, Manifest Destiny is chapter 13, California Gold Rush is chapter 14. They're all disconnected. But in reality, they all contributed to the situation in this country. Slavery would not go away. In 1850, there was a Refugee Slave Act that said that any slave that leaves the South and escapes to the North must be returned to the owner in the South, and that the governments of the North can make any citizen part of the police to capture that slave. That was part of the ruling, that was part of the intent in Arizona a few years ago. If an undocumented worker shows up, you were supposed to turn that person in. If you help that person, you're guilty. So they wanted in Arizona a few years ago, they wanted to make it a crime to help an undocumented person. The Refugee Slave Act did the same in the North. It made it a crime to help an escaped slave. That's when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She wrote it in a response to that injustice. And that book, this is interesting, that book was a bigger seller in its time than Harry Potter. Not only was it a bigger seller, they sold more action figures, toys, games, music, and drama. It was very big, much bigger. Then the Dred Scott decision, where the US Supreme Court said an escaped slave must not only return to the South, but cannot become free. So it's a citizenship question. An escaped slave who lives in the North, has a family, gets married to a free woman, has a family, is not a citizen, does not get all the protection from the court, and can be forced to go back to the South. This was a famous US Supreme Court case. Slavery was actually getting much more intense. The Know-Nothing governors, these people who were committing crimes against Catholics formed a party, and they started running their own candidates. It's not like the Tea Party, maybe, okay, if you can think about it. These Know-Nothing people were strong, anti-black, anti-Negroes. They wanted separation of whites and blacks. And they were beginning to get elected to governments in states. But they had a lot of support. Because the truth was, at this time, labor organizations and community organizations, a lot of them did not like slavery, but they did not like black people either. So they wanted to keep people apart, white, black, and no mixing. That was part of the problem. People did not want mixing like we have today. They didn't want it then. They wanted to be like South Africa from 20 years ago, when you had official separation. But some of these people actually got elected to office, and later they left during the Civil War. And so we had the Civil War. The British were trying to make money from the Civil War by shipping Chinese to Latin America to grow food for their business. Some U.S. ships were actually transporting Chinese to Latin America, and President Lincoln signed a bill saying, stop that. We don't ship people into slavery. After the Civil War, there were amendments to the Constitution, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, ending slavery. Yes?
Kelly.
Yes, yes. How are we doing?
We'll want time for questions in this
Yeah,
session.
so we're going to finish really quickly. 13th and 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution, giving, abolishing slavery, recognizing blacks who were born in America as citizens, but they had to pass a law too, because what about Africans living as slaves in America? Can they be naturalized? According to this, the answer was no. But in a rule from this time, the Congress said yes. Africans in America as slaves can be naturalized, they can become citizens. That's when this man stood up, a senator, Charles Sumner, and he said, take the word white out of this law. Just take it out. Let everyone become a citizen. And he fought very hard. He and a few other senators said he was against white only. He lost, of course. The reason he lost was because the situation in the West, California, Oregon, and Washington was getting very, very intense against Chinese. Now the Chinese were being killed in America. Vancouver, Washington, Canada, had a huge riot against Chinese where hundreds were killed. This is about the same time. So anti-Chinese feelings were very strong. 1882, finally, the power of the Western senators and the Western representatives, they forced through Congress the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically said no more Chinese can come here except if you have family or you already have a business, but no more laborers, no more workers can come from China into the United States. This would not change for 70 years. For 70 years, 7-0, no Chinese, except if the very few who had family could come. They would make it a crime for women to come. They would make it a crime to hire Chinese. In fact, in San Francisco, there were a lot of riots by white workers against Chinese. So you can see this is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That's why the Congress passed their law this summer saying we're sorry. Because they realized that all of these forces contributed to this kind of hatred of what is slave, what is African, what is Chinese, and also what is Mexican. Of what is Mexican. Before we go to questions, let me just say, you have the bibliography. This book, Race and Manifest Destiny, is a very good discussion about what the newspapers and politicians at that time were saying. So you could see the opinions of people expressed through newspapers and politicians. Manifest Destiny, this one has a very good discussion about the war against Mexico. Indispensable Enemy also has very good information about the situation in California in the West with the Chinese and the impact on national immigration. So this is a lot. This is a lot. It's only half of what I could present. So I want to take questions because I'm sure there are a lot of questions about this. But same thing through the 18 afterwards, especially afterwards, the defense of white privilege got even stronger. And the restriction against Asian got stronger. And the restrictions against people from this country got stronger. So exclusion got stronger. Until finally, after World War II, the world was smaller. People were looking at American politics closely. And the United States, the control of exclusion got weaker. And more people came in till 1965. The Major Immigration Act allowed more people from around the world to come into the United States. And since 1965, we've seen more people come here, live here, do business here. And it's beginning to change our society. But like I said, a lot of these feelings are still very strong. They haven't gone away. We need to learn this history, and we need to continue to work together to make sure they don't come back. Okay, so thank you very much, and on to questions. Yes?
Was it only Chinese or any other Asians?
So the question was it only Chinese? So it started with Chinese. And then about 18 years later, it was Japanese. And about 10 years after that, it included others from the Asian area, as far as India. So it just kept expanding until it included India, the East Indies, and Japan. So this category of exclusion kept growing. It got very difficult when the United States conquered Hawaii. And so many Japanese and Chinese lived in Hawaii. They didn't know what to do with it, but they kept excluding the Hawaiian people from their rights. Yes?
This is kind of a related question, but what made them against the Chinese or censor them out in particular in regards to other immigrants?
Everybody hear that? So why the Chinese so much? And it's a good question, because the United States wanted to do a lot of trade with China. They wanted good relations with China, because like today, they saw opportunities for business. But what happened was that on the West Coast, there was just a lot of competition between white workers and Chinese workers. The Chinese participated in the building of the railroads. in the Sierra Mountains, the most dangerous kind of work. We cannot imagine, okay? We cannot imagine what it's like to work in the snow on a cliff handling dynamite. But the Chinese did it to build this railroad. So they were very skilled, but they were competing with the white workers for a lot of this work. So there was a lot of competition. There was a lot of violence against the Chinese organized by workers' parties in San Francisco and Los Angeles because they saw the threat. And there was also violence against Chinese business owners too. They were seen as a threat. In the back?
So in what year was there that great fire in San Francisco that destroyed the records of the Chinese immigrants?
Yeah. Everybody hear about that? The earthquake and fire of San Francisco was actually April 1906. And what happened was that City Hall burned down. City Hall was built very cheaply, and it collapsed and burned, and all the records were lost from that fire. So a lot of Chinese had the opportunity to re-register themselves legally without having to bother with too much paper because of the emergency situation. But the other thing that happened in 1906 was the San Francisco government decided it was time to move against the Japanese. So they were excluding Japanese from some schools. Even President Theodore Roosevelt tried to intervene and defend the Japanese, but it wasn't enough. There was so much anti-immigrant sentiment that the Japanese were also victims of exclusion. Yes?
So you talk about how only white can become American citizen. So what about Asian at that time? That they are after the Exclusion Act, that some of them can stay in America, but can they be viewed as American citizen, or they still be viewed as Chinese?
Yeah, okay. Good question. The children born in America became citizens, okay, number one, okay? And we know today that there are people who want to take that away. Are we aware of that? It's a constitutional right, but there are political people who want to take that away. But children born in the United States were citizens. President Theodore Roosevelt tried for a little while to win the naturalization for Japanese, but he couldn't do much. So Asians were excluded. Even the Filipinos who were conquered by the Spanish-American War, they were nationals. The Puerto Ricans who were conquered in the Spanish-American War became citizens. It's a different, they're a different category. They're not Asian, but it was possible. You see that there were choices. Puerto Ricans were made citizens, but not Filipinos. Very interesting contrast. Yes?
I kind of want Kayleen to speak on something too. I want to ask for you to clarify what I'm about to try and ask. So there's this sociological concept of the labor, what's it called? The labor?
Dual labor market?
Yeah. And I want to ask if you think it's the same then as it is now, where, you know, the people in control are making the money, create this situation where the two sets of workers kind of go against each other, like the white workers and Chinese workers, and they're, you know, maybe the Chinese were paid a little less.
Right.
It's kind of a thing where the railroads win and turn these two groups kind of against each other. And is that what's happening still now with immigrants or illegal immigrants from Mexico and South America?
That's very interesting. There were defenders of immigration, the large companies, the railroads were happy to have the Chinese. In fact, the railroad managers wanted more. But of course, after the job was done, they just let these people loose. And they had no concern for them. We didn't have unemployment insurance or anything like that. So these people were just fending for themselves, and it was worker against worker.
Did they pay them the same rates though?
No,
Okay.
The Chinese worked for less. Oh yeah, it was a great win-win situation for the Southern Pacific Central Railroad. The track was laid. The more the track that was built, the more wealth that the railroad created, and the Chinese were a big part of it. I don't think there was any deliberate move to actually pit. I think in the West, I don't think there was, but back east, the owners of factories, especially Carnegie and McCormick and the other big industrialists, did use immigrant workers, especially in the coal mines, to put the, have the workers fight each other and try to divide them.
And keep was that a move when labor unions were emerging,
yes,
or
it was a
labor?
very mixed history. The unions tried to bring people together, but some of the unions could not handle the Chinese issue, and they felt they failed to defend Chinese workers. They tried, and then later they failed. It was a very, very tragic episode. And I'm a member of a union, so it's very sad for me to think that these other unions abandoned Chinese workers at very difficult times. But that's the history. Hold on. Anyone else? Yes.
I read that book. There was about it like World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and they talk about it like the soldiers that served in World War II. There were a lot of people that were from Japan, and actually they feel a lot of people, all people that were here, they feel that the people from here, like told the same people, the people from Japan that were here were like infiltrators from Japan, because like Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. So my question is, it's true that by even though like the soldiers, the Japanese soldiers that fight that war, do they get it as national citizenship here, or they didn't? Like, because in the book doesn't say that if you fight in the war, you get it like you get it to be citizen here. That you say that a lot of Japanese people were to fight to the World War II.
Everybody hear that? So in World War II, Japanese did volunteer to fight for the U.S. Army after the internment camps. Most of those were U.S. citizens, okay? Most of those were U.S. citizens born in the United States. Their parents, though, were still excluded from becoming citizens. So that's part of the tragedy of that time. The parents, like I said, exclusion had grown, so the parents of that generation could not become citizens, but the children were born here. And they of course, citizen and non-citizen families were taken to the internment camps. And there, some of the young boys decided to become soldiers for the United. It was a big question, to fight or not to fight for the United States Army from inside the prison to go out. It was like you're right. It's a big history. Yes.
Can you explain a little bit more about what the DREAM Act is?
Oh, the DREAM Act. Yes, the DREAM Act is it's about 10 years old, and it's a move to allow young people in the United States who were brought as children into the country without papers, undocumented, and it would give. It was a national project. It would be congressional legislation, and it would allow children who graduated from high school to continue to stay in this country legally, and to continue with higher education, go into the Army, and then afterwards try to normalize their status. So the original DREAM Act was actually quite ambitious, which is to give young people who have no decision to come here the opportunity to stay here as a resident and perhaps later become a citizen. That was the original DREAM Act. In the time in between, in Congress, they've attached other conditions to it. But essentially, that's what the DREAM Act is.
And so you were saying that people are now trying to fight that?
No, we're still supporting the DREAM Act.
Okay.
And in fact, in the summer, President Obama declared a presidential order to the Justice Department. It was called the Deferred Action for Children of Childhood Arrivals, DACA. And it allows children who were brought here the opportunity to stay for 2 years if they can prove they came here very young, under 16, that they're still under 30, and that they're finishing high school or getting GEDs. So it's a very limited program to allow children to stay another few years to try to regularize finish college
Is
perhaps.
that just a stopgap measure until they figure out?
Yes, it's
how to
very,
pass the
very
agreement?
stopgap. There's no, after 2 years, there's no guarantee of anything. But for 2 years, you can try to get a driver's license. You have permission to work. You can stay as a student.
Are you talking about the fact, I think she's talking about the fact that now they're trying to, you said, I think you were talking about them trying to take away being a citizen if you were born here, if your parents are illegal. Is that what you're saying? Were you
Yes,
talking about?
yes,
Yeah,
that-
I think that's what.
That's a real proposal coming from the Republican Party to eliminate that law.
But I had just another question. What about after that 2 years? Like after 2 years that you are here, like for example, there are a lot of, I know a lot of people. I was an immigrant. I came as an immigrant here 2 times when I was 15 and when I was 17. My question is, after those 2 years, like if you get the documentation to immigration can go, like, you know, because immigration, if you don't have no papers, a lot of times they just can go and take you and make a deportation process to you. But if you do, like, if they had all your information, after those 2 years, if nothing happened or nothing changed, you can get in a list for getting deported. Like to get in, I get deported in 2008 one time. But after those 2 years, like if you nothing changed, that an immigration has all your information.
Right.
So they
right.
can deport you, like they have the right to do it.
That's a good question because it's a very stopgap measure, DACA, and to qualify for it, these young people have to give information to the Immigration Service. And it includes their name, their address, phone number, and it's only good, if you get it, it's good for 2 years. At this time, there is no legislation past 2 years. It's a big chance, it's a big risk, but a lot of young people are going to do it. And our union wants to, and other organizations, we want to defend them by making this issue even a bigger issue. Nobody talked about it during the elections, but we still want to push and make this issue very, very high profile. Yes?
So are you saying that you are for just open immigration? Like, because you're talking about naturalizing people who are already in the country, you know, illegally.
President Reagan did that in 1983 with the
Yeah,
IRCA. Yeah.
I'm saying, like, as far as like this immigration issue that we have right now, what would you say, like, your plan of action would be to go after it, or is it a problem? I guess is what I'm asking.
What's a problem is that people have to lead secret lives, and they cannot go out and do what they have to do because they don't have documents. Our union is for the legalization of everyone who lives here. Okay, no more secret lives, no more hidden in the darkness. We're not talking about border or who crosses the border, but right now, we say everyone who's here should be legalized. No one should be illegal, no one should be undocumented, everyone should have right to work and to education, and all the obligations that go with it. So that's what we're looking at.
One more question.
Somebody over there for more question. Just what happens after, if that was the case, I'm playing devil's advocate here, if that's the case, then a year later when more people come, it's the same, it is basically open borders. Permanently, because there'll be more people from all over, not just, so that's,
Yes.
They just
Yes,
made
but
it legal 11 million, the 11 million immigrants that already are here will become like citizens.
Right.
There is an immigration reform approved in the Congress, but that don't mean that everyone that came will get papers, just the people that have it like a circumstance.
I understand that part, but
Yeah.
the thing is, if that's the case, then the next, it's a continuum, is what I'm saying. And I'm not saying no or yes, I was just opening up that.
Right.
Well, too, because we also have people waiting for legal immigration.
Yeah.
That if you naturalize people that are already here, you know, you're kind of cutting in line the people who are
Let me
waiting.
just finish up with that, because I know you have to leave. Because in 1924, if you continue to study this, 1892, the Immigration Service was started. They set up Ellis Island and Angel Island in California. And actually, the whole notion of a line is a myth. Okay, the whole notion of waiting in line is a myth. The reason why we have lines today is exclusion. They don't want all the people of the world to come in so easily. So it's true, there are people waiting, but historically, tens of millions of people came from Europe, and they just walked through the gates. People just watch you walk in, put your name, welcome, go on. I'm sorry, I don't have enough time for it, but yeah, it was open borders, and we can live with open borders again. Thank you.
Just one announcement, and maybe there's enough, maybe you want to make one too. Next week, Tarek Gidey is going to be here. He teaches geography at our college, and he's going to be talking about the fact that a number of countries in the world are grabbing huge amounts of land in Africa in order to get mineral rights, agricultural rights. It's putting communities in those countries at risk of not having enough food. So he's going to talk about that issue. Hope you can make it. And I want to thank John Martinez for coming.
Thank you, everyone.
54% of those purchases are going